Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss Brilliant Disaster, JFK, Castro, and America's Doomed Invasion. The book discusses the Bay of Pigs crisis of 1961, which set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis 1 year later, in October 1962. Joining me today is the book's author, Jim Rasenberger, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jim, thank you for coming up, and I couldn't help but notice, and we've been briefly talking about the fact that your father played a role, however small it may have been, in a lot of these episodes, or in some of these episodes. And he was a lawyer in Washington, and I even interviewed at his law firm once. But I would like to I'd like you to tell the audience, before we get into the book and the Bay of Pigs crisis itself, tell us a little bit about your father and his roles and how, if at all, it has affected you.
Castro took 1,000 men prisoner. The Kennedy administration wanted to get these guys out of Cuba, and they brought in a handful of young Washington attorneys to help out, and that's what my father did. Not a huge a footnote in history, but a big deal in his life. And what it did to me was just introduce me to the Bay of Pigs at a young age. I was curious about it. I always wondered, what had happened. It was such a strange name, the Bay of Pigs.
Right,
something kind of horrific. And later, when I became a writer, I went back to it and I thought, boy, this would be really interesting to go back and look at this again. It had been written about, but I always thought it had been written about with sort of an axe to grind or finger pointing, because there's so much passion afterwards. I thought it would be interesting to go back and look at it one more time, and clear-eyed, no point of view, and just try to find out, how did this happen? How did this group of very intelligent men, the best and the brightest in the Kennedy administration, get themselves involved in this? So, my father's role as a writer was to get me interested in this subject, which I have to thank him for.
Yeah. Actually, it occurred, did it not, just perhaps 5 or 6 months before you were born?
Well, yes, it occurred shortly before I was born, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred right after I was born. So I can't say I remember much of this, but I was there.
Yeah, and you have certainly read a lot about it.
But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger, and yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security.
I mean, one of the problems, it seems to me, and I think that, if I remember correctly, you say it too, is that these people were almost too smart. They had always been enormously successful. They couldn't fathom how they could be such failures.
Well, that's the title of the book, The Brilliant Disaster, and it's ironic, of course, and it's oxymoronic, but the brilliant part is the men who did it.
Yeah.
They were the best and the brightest, and a number of Rhodes Scholars. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, had been a Rhodes Scholar. There were many Rhodes Scholars. There was McGeorge Bundy, who'd been the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Harvard at the age of 34. He was just, I think, 42 at the time. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, had been the president of Ford Motor Company at the age of 40. All of these guys were really smart and really successful and had never really failed at anything. And I do think you have to attribute part of what happened to the fact that when they got in a room together and they looked around at each other, they saw a lot of brilliant people who they respected, and then they in themselves, they saw people who did not fail, and they forgot about Murphy's Law. You know, things go wrong.
Yeah.
So I jokingly say it might have helped to have a few less brilliant people, regular people, you know, in presidential administrations, people like me, for instance, I'm available, people to point out that things don't always go the way you plan them. And that would have been a good thing for people to think about.
And people who ask what are thought to be dumb questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And nobody wanted to embarrass themselves by asking those dumb questions.
Right. And that, I take it, is part of why you say that groupthink took over.
Yes. Groupthink did. There were a number of factors, I think, that led to this bad decision. You have to forgive them a little bit because this did occur only 3 months into the beginning of the administration. And a lot of these, they were still finding their way to the men's room. I mean, they hadn't gotten their sea legs yet. And then they also they didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of the president, or in front of each other. But groupthink is the famous book by Irving Janis written in 1972 that was inspired by the Bay of Pigs. He was asking himself, how could it be that all these smart people could make such a bad decision? And he came up with a theory that when you get people of similar backgrounds into a room, there is an impetus to agree with each other. Nobody wants to stand out, particularly when, I mean, these guys really did come from, they had similar resumes. A lot of them had gone to East Coast boarding schools, Ivy League colleges. They knew each other socially. They had reason to agree with each other and to assume the other guy was right. The one person, I mean, Irving Janis's book really refers to one meeting particularly that happened just over 10 days before the invasion, April 4th of 1961, when you had all these guys in a conference room in the State Department. And Kennedy goes around and asks them what they think, and they all vote for it. Now later they all say they had major reservations about it, but they didn't voice them at the time. The one guy who did voice reservations was an outsider. It was a senator who really shouldn't have been at that meeting, Senator William Fulbright. Right. Kennedy had invited him in knowing that he had problems with the plan. And he got up and gave this rousing speech about how this was a terrible idea, un-American, impractical, wrong in every respect. And he became the foil that everybody sort of ganged up on. And as Janis wrote, it really only confirmed what people believed. You know, when you have one person that you can say, oh, he's the outsider, those who already are prone to agree with each other, it sort of solidifies their belief in their own opinion.
Yep. You know, you see that everywhere in life. I'm in meetings all the time where that is obviously an operation. Right. And it's as you say. I mean, I was at a fraternity reunion a week ago, and we sat around in a circle, and we call it good and welfare, and I listened to people talk, and everybody was agreeing about certain things, and nobody wants to challenge that.
Right.
Nobody wants, as you say, to be seen as the odd man out, because they do gang up on you. I mean, I'm not saying it would have happened there, but in general, they do gang up on you. It is thought by some people that the Bay of Pigs led almost in a direct line to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I gather you were up here talking about the interim 18 months or so, however many months it was, between 12 months, whatever, between the two events. And also that the Bay of Pigs, how did Lyndon Johnson put it? The road to Dallas led through the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the Bay of Pigs itself was a 5-day event, cost just $43 million. I mean, you couldn't even make a movie about the Bay of Pigs for that now. I mean, this was in a very small event in some ways, but what the repercussions of it and the way it just resounded through history are amazing. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a good place to start.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
You know, the conventional wisdom about Kennedy is that he learned his lesson in the Bay of Pigs, and that lesson was, don't listen to the CIA. Take the advice of the Joint Chiefs with a grain of salt. Listen to your closer advisors. Listen to Bobby. He really became close to Bobby Kennedy after this. Or people like Ted Sorensen, people that he'd worked with before, knew and trusted. And that this prepared him for the Cuban Missile Crisis, so that when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along during those famous 13 days, he knew to ignore the Joint Chiefs of Staff when they said go in and invade or go and bomb, but he kept his own counsel and the counsel of those closest to him. Well, that's true. That story is true. But what people don't sometimes recognize about the link between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis is how those 18 months intervening led to those 13 days. Immediately after the Bay of Pigs, in fact, the day after the Bay of Pigs invasion ended, this is April 20th of 1961, John Kennedy did a number of important things. One was he put together a commission led by Lyndon Johnson to look into ways to put a man on the moon. That one worked out pretty well. Another one...
Was that in part attributable to the Bay of Pigs?
Absolutely. He was looking for a victory. He needed a victory over the Soviets. So the same day he does that, then he also appoints a task force in the Pentagon to look into ways to hold back communism in Southeast Asia, South Vietnam, which had really been a back burner issue until this day. But that task force is appointed, it comes back a week later and suggests putting in more advisors into Vietnam. And this is really the first step in the escalation to Vietnam. And thirdly, what he does that day is he appoints a task force in the Pentagon to look into ways to overthrow Fidel Castro. Rather than back off of trying to overthrow Castro, his reaction was to double down, to go back. So while the Pentagon's looking into ways to overtly throw Castro, Bobby Kennedy becomes the point man for a covert operation called Operation Mongoose to find covert ways to overthrow Castro. There's a lot of sabotage, assassination plots, all sorts of mayhem. Now the problem is that Castro knew about Operation Mongoose. He knew about all these plans to overthrow him and to kill him.
How did he know that?
He knew because every Cuban exile in Miami knew, and Castro had spies in Miami. So he had no trouble knowing all the details.
Yeah.
He knew a lot about the Bay of Pigs invasion prior to it being launched as well.
Yeah.
Khrushchev knew about Mongoose. Castro has suggested in interviews that Khrushchev knew about the Pentagon planning as well, that there was a Pentagon plan to overthrow Castro, at least a contingency plan. So the point is that Castro and Khrushchev had every reason to believe that John Kennedy was continuing to try to overthrow Fidel Castro, because he was. So it makes you, even though what Khrushchev did obviously was reckless and dangerous, it didn't come out of nowhere. He felt provoked that he was going to lose Cuba to the United States if he didn't do something about it. So that's, Kennedy, I think, we can compliment him for his behavior during the 13 days, but he was somewhat complicitous in the circumstances that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Is that a point which has been not exactly lost in the welter of history, but been downplayed?
Well, it has been, and part of that is the early histories didn't know about Operation Mongoose. The historians didn't know about it, so those 18 months were kind of a blank. Nobody really understood how much the Kennedys had been provoking Khrushchev and Castro. Now, a lot has come out in the intervening years about Operation Mongoose, but what's incredible to me is how, even though it's in history books now, it still gets downplayed. I mean, still the story about the Cuban Missile Crisis is always about those 13 days and Kennedy's wise behavior during that. But I'm still surprised that it hasn't gotten more attention from historians who really know the facts, because it's really indisputable. And by the way, it's the same thing, set of circumstances you have to think about when you start talking about Kennedy's assassination, this provocation of Castro and the Soviet Union. And the Kennedy administration didn't really want that information out, obviously, because they didn't want it to look like Kennedy was provoking Castro, that might have set up a circumstance where Castro would try, as Lyndon Johnson once said, I think his phrase was something like, he knew that Kennedy was trying to get him, so he came and got him first.
Yeah, yeah.
Not to say that Castro did that, but you can, there's a logic to these things. The Kennedys were very provocative. They were very aggressive after the Bay of Pigs. They had been not only, had the country been hurt, but the Kennedy name had been hurt. And they fought back relentlessly, and I think you could argue a bit recklessly.
Yeah.
Too.
You say, I think, that the Bay of Pigs, one of the consequences of the Bay of Pigs was it changed Americans' viewpoint towards their own government, its competence, its truthfulness. Notwithstanding, we already knew that Eisenhower had lied about the U-2.
U-2, sure.
But your point is it dramatically changed the country's views of its leadership. Maybe you could just elaborate
prior to the Bay of Pigs, yes, there had been incidents. There had been the U-2 a year before. But it would have been a pretty cynical American who doubted that he lived in a country led by competent, decent men trying to do the right thing and who were basically honest. But after the Bay of Pigs, that view became impossible to hold on to. I mean, the whole view of, the leaders who had led America through the First World War and then the Second World War, people like Eisenhower, because what happened is, Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy aide and then a historian, phrased it something like, we not only looked incompetent, we looked incompetent and stupid, and we looked incompetent and stupid and weak. And that combination was awful, and it made it difficult. It wasn't simply the fact that the United States had lost the Bay of Pigs. It was the fact that there had been so much lying involved in it. I do think it changed the way Americans thought of their government. And this is just before Vietnam War, which of course took those kernels of doubt and then ran with them.
Yeah, yeah.
The mixed metaphors.
I gather that after the Bay of Pigs, Eisenhower told Kennedy privately, because he was down at the White House once or twice, I guess, told him privately, look, once you make a decision, you don't change horses in midstream, you don't decide we'll do this but not that, or that but not this. You carry out the plans that you lay. You cast the die, and if you live or die by that cast of the dice.
Yes, there was a meeting, Kennedy, on April 22nd of 1961, so this is 3 days after the invasion failed. Kennedy, looking, I think, for a little bit of presidential solace, a little companionship, a little pat on the back from Eisenhower, invited him to Camp David. And Eisenhower came down and really took Kennedy to the woodshed. He said, exactly as you said, he said, when you launch an operation like this, you're in it to win. You can't go halfway in. And essentially said, you've made a great mistake here, and if I'd done this, I would have won it. And I wouldn't have only gone in halfway. So that was devastating for Kennedy to hear that from Eisenhower.
We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy.
To the mid-50s.
Mm-hmm.
This notion of Eisenhower's that if you're going to do it, you do it to win. You don't do it in some half-baked method, particularly when the half-baked method leaves the opponent alive and kicking to fight another day, and you know he's going to kick you, and you know exactly where he's going to kick you.
Right.
I wonder whether this had something to do with Eisenhower's refusal, for example, to even think about intervening in Vietnam in 1954, 1955, contrary to the advice of people like Nixon and I think Arleigh Burke, if I remember correctly. I guess Eisenhower is a guy who'd been the general and who'd had the responsibility for D-Day, in which, he had that note in his pocket, if this fails, it's all my fault.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't find Eisenhower saying, well, we won't send the mulberries over. No. We'll lighten up on the air cover. No, you're going to do it. You're going to do it all the way. I just can't help thinking that this knowledge about how you must do things if you do them must have had some impact on Eisenhower's thinking in the mid-50s.
I think that's true. The question of I've been asked this many times, what would Eisenhower have done? Would he in fact have done as he said he would have done and gone all in? And I'm not really sure of the answer to that, because Eisenhower, just like Kennedy, was very concerned about starting something with the Soviet Union, which is why Eisenhower was a big fan of covert activity. It was really Eisenhower who got the CIA involved in these covert operations, because what if they worked, what they could do, as he saw it, was assert American power, but do it in a way that didn't raise the stakes so high that you A, had to win, or B, that you were going to start nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And these seem to have been successful under Eisenhower. There was one in Iran in 1953, another in Guatemala in 1954. Would Eisenhower actually have sent in overt military force in the Bay of Pigs when it was clear that things were going badly for the Cuban brigade? He would have known, like Kennedy, that that Khrushchev would have responded, and indeed I'm sure Khrushchev would have responded, probably in West Berlin, a city that he'd been threatening to basically take and make a part of East Germany. And then that would have, a whole series of events would have escalated from that. So I am, the problem with the Bay of Pigs is, even looking back on it from 50 years, there are no simple answers. Certainly not any simple answers if you are in it, looking at it from the point of view of John Kennedy at a time when, A, Fidel Castro was seen as a huge menace. Communism seemed to be coming in from all sides. So it was intolerable to have a communist dictator with ties to the Soviet Union 90 miles from American shores on the one hand, but on the other hand, you didn't want to do anything to start this escalation with the Soviet Union. So a covert operation seemed to be the way to go. The problem was, it was hard to, nobody really had any great plan for how you covertly remove Fidel Castro. And many plans were thought about before this invasion plan, which was kind of like a miniature World War II type of invasion. There were plans to put small groups in, many plans, as I think I've said, to assassinate Castro, or even assassinate Castro and Che Guevara and Raul Castro all in one fell swoop, take out the entire leadership of Cuba. But none of them were really great plans. That was the problem with it. And in the end, Kennedy was left with this invasion plan, and I think he went with it because he didn't know how not to go with it. Yeah. He didn't know, how to say no to a plan to get rid of Castro.
Yeah. I wasn't there. I was only 4 years old, but maybe 5. But Eisenhower was under some pressure, or at least afterwards, under criticism for not taking Berlin. Mm-hmm. And he saw no reason to take Berlin when the casualties would have been staggering. And the Russians were going to take it, and they suffered 200,000 I don't remember whether it was 200,000 casualties or 200,000 dead. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, bears on what you're saying he might or might not have done in the Bay of Pigs, because it was not escalation since it was World War II, but yeah, it's a form of raising the stakes for your own people.
Yeah.
And right. So he was cognizant about those kinds of things.
Well, I think Eisenhower was a much less reckless president in some ways than Kennedy. I mean, Eisenhower really was concerned about starting nuclear war.
Yeah.
And John Kennedy, I think, was too, but as I said, I think he did some reckless things that helped provoke the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's hard for me to imagine Eisenhower doing what so many people wanted Kennedy to do during the Bay of Pigs, which was unleash American Navy jets to go in and take care of Castro's planes. It's hard for me to see Eisenhower doing that, because Eisenhower knew what that meant if he did that. Kennedy said once, this is right after the Bay of Pigs, he said, if I had put any American presence there, it might as well have been an overt American operation to begin with, because we own it at that point. The moment you put any Americans into it, we own the operation, and then we have to win it. And then this becomes a global part of the whole global struggle with the Soviet Union. This is not about the United States and Cuba. It's certainly not about a band of Cuban exiles in Castro. It's suddenly, a global struggle that involves nuclear weapons, potentially.
I take it, Jim, that for practical purposes, in my recollection of the 50s is, they say, if you can remember it, you weren't there, you weren't doing what you should have been doing.
I think that's the 60s they say that about.
That's right, but everything, the stakes were that way with everything, whether it was the British, French, Israeli, Suez actions, the two islands between Taiwan and communist China, everything involved.
That was one of the things I really, that struck me writing this book, is what it meant to be a president during the Cold War, when every decision you made had implications having to do with your position with the Soviet Union. I mean, the whole thing was a psychological game of, because they couldn't actually go to war. So it all was about this bizarre psychological gamesmanship. Yeah. But of course, there always was the specter of war. in the end, and it was real. During the Bay of Pigs, I discovered Khrushchev was basically threatened nuclear war. I mean, he wrote a letter to Kennedy just after the invasion began, saying, we will not permit the United States to go into Cuba. And if you should, his term was, we promise incomparable conflagration. And he mentions the heartland of the United States. Now, what's he referring to? Obviously, he's referring to basically a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons. So, I mean, it was always there. And you have to keep that in mind when you think of, again, why Kennedy would not want to have sent in American jets to save the day. He had just read this letter from Khrushchev saying, you know, we'll take action. Now, it's very doubtful Khrushchev would have gone to nukes, but Kennedy really had to worry about Berlin. Khrushchev already had said he was going to cut West Berlin off, and if he did that, Kennedy would have to have had responded, and there would have necessarily been an escalation from that. Some sort of, hard to imagine that not becoming a military event once Berlin got involved in it.
I have no intention of establishing a new Office of War Information to govern the flow of news. I am not suggesting any new forms of censorship or new types of security classifications. I have no easy answer to the dilemma that I have posed and would not seek to impose it if I had one. But I am asking the members of the newspaper profession and the industry in this country to re-examine their own responsibilities, to consider the degree and the nature of the present danger, and to heed the duty of self-restraint, which that danger imposes upon us all. Every newspaper now asks itself, with respect to every story, is it news? All I suggest is that you add the question, is it in the interest of national security?
Jim, tell me something that, or your answer to something that's always bothered me extensively. It's the old question of so what? So what if Castro, a communist, is in Cuba? From the standpoint of the United States, so what? On the other hand, from the standpoint of Russia, if we were to take over Cuba, so what? And, you know, we're facing the same problem, always have, in Afghanistan, Iraq, all these things. You look at it and, you know, 30 years later or 50 years later, say, yeah, so what? What would have happened? What's the big deal?
Right. Well, that's definitely the case with Cuba. When you, I mean, the incredible thing is how few people recognize it at the time. I mentioned William Fulbright.
Yeah.
He had a great
Johnson called him half-bright because he was so opposed.
Yes. But he himself had been a Rhodes Scholar, and it was the Fulbright scholarships, and he was a very bright guy. And he said something very smart at the time, which is, Castro is a thorn in the side, he's not a dagger in the heart.
Yeah.
He's an annoyance, he's a nuisance.
Yeah.
And we should have treated him like a nuisance, because everything we did to treat him as more than a nuisance only made him stronger.
Yeah.
And gave him all the excuses he needed to his own people for why their economy was so bad. Oh, he kept blaming it on the Americans.
Yeah.
It's possible his own people would have overthrown him rather quickly if we'd never gotten involved in it.
Yeah.
And look what happened. Castro survived. If you count Obama, it's 11 U.S. presidents. That's a quarter of all American presidents. And we're still here, and so is he, you know. But this is why I went back. I spent a lot of time sort of trying to get into the mindset of somebody in a position of leadership at that time, or even an American at that time. The fear of communism was overwhelming. Yes. I mean, it was a kind of paranoia, but it wasn't unreasonable in some ways. If you go back and you think, 1949, China, the most populous country on earth, becomes communist. That same year, the Soviet Union explodes their first atomic weapon. I mean, that's a mind-blowing year right there. It's liable to make anybody frightened. And then 1957, of course, Sputnik. It wasn't the satellite that was scary. It was the rocket the Soviets used to send that satellite into space. If they could build rockets that could put satellites into orbit, they could build rockets that could put nuclear warheads into the United States. So there was real fear. And Khrushchev, never shied from warmongering rhetoric. He had this famous statement, "We will bury you."
Oh, he's terrible.
And so people were justifiably nervous. They saw this international communist conspiracy sweeping across the globe, armed with nuclear weapons, and here they are now at our shores. And you can see at the time how that would be intolerable.
Well, I lived through it, so I know how intolerable it was considered.
In 1889, the first international American conference was held, and Cuba was not present. Then as now, Cuba was the only state in the hemisphere still controlled by a foreign monarch. Then as now, Cuba was excluded from the Society of Free Nations. And then as now, brave men in Florida and New York dedicated their lives and their energies to the freedom of their homeland. The brigade comes from behind prison walls, but you leave behind you more than 6 million of your fellow countrymen who are also, in a very real sense, in prison. For Cuba is today, as Marty described it many years ago, as beautiful as Greece and stretched out in chains, a prison moated by water.
But let me ask a question. What is it that a question which I don't think people stopped to think about in those days. Mm-hmm. What is it that we feared? Did we fear that militarily Russia would take us over, or China? Did we fear that economically we would become a pygmy and our people's standard of living would go down? Or was it what Roosevelt once called an undifferentiated fear, which I would say has something to do with the idea that we're number one. Mm-hmm. That's a personal viewpoint. What is it exactly that had all these people frightened to death?
It's a great question, and I thought a lot about that. So what would have happened if, let's say Castro, the worst case scenario had happened. Castro's communist, and then he exports communism to South American countries. I suppose practically it would hurt us economically in terms of trade. You could see how it would have some effect on our influence around the globe, and it could hurt us financially. I do think that there's in some way, an argument to be made that it would have been bad for the United States had a huge part of the world been under the domination of the Soviet Union and China. People just kept referring to the American way of life is in jeopardy, without really specifying, as you say, what exactly? What's going to happen? Are we going to have communists, camping out in our backyards? What does this mean? I don't really know the answer to why that fear was so intense, and I don't. And it clearly now we can look back and say that was not justified. But certainly at the time, there was this real belief that the communists were coming in closer and closer, and were going to get us.
What we oppose fundamentally is the aggressive nature of the communist state. Its unceasing effort to expand wherever it can, to grow bigger, to take over, to supplant. This deadly impulse toward aggression we oppose as a continual threat to peace. These are the contrasting points of view between the major antagonists in the conflict which has become known over the last decade as the Cold War.
Initially, if I remember correctly, Americans' reactions to Castro, including even Nixon's and the CIA's, were reasonably favorable. And they changed. So why were they favorable, and why did they change?
Batista, the dictator of Cuba before Castro took over, had been a really bad guy, and everybody on both sides of the political spectrum knew that. So when Fidel Castro came in January 1st, 1959, really everybody was excited by it. There were certainly people in the Eisenhower administration who were concerned about him. They didn't really know what to make of him. They knew he was a leftist. But, you know, there was a general excitement. And then Castro comes to the United States 3 months later after coming into power in April of 1959. This is where I begin my book. And he is greeted with just adulation. Huge crowds greet him at the airport. It's like the Beatles coming, you know, 5 years later.
Yeah.
And, you know, and he arrives with cases of rum and Cuban cigars. And then he goes around and is interviewed by many distinguished people, including Vice President Nixon, who has a 2.5-hour meeting with him. And the question everybody wants to ask him is, are you a communist? Will you be a communist? Have you ever been a communist? And
Why did they want to ask him that question?
because because of course they knew he was on the left. Now he'd had no ties, no meetings at all with anyone in the Soviet Union. In fact, until he happened to meet the Soviet ambassador to the United States at a reception during that visit in April of 1959. But they really didn't have a lot of reason to believe he was a communist, except that he clearly had a leftist political point of view. And Castro answered all of them properly, no, I've never been a communist. I never would be a communist. His brother Raul had apparently been part of the Communist Party in Cuba. And Che Guevara had been associated with the Communist Party. So they knew there were communists around him. Nixon has this meeting with him where he's basically trying to warn him about the fact that he's surrounded by communists and he must be careful not to be influenced by them. Now it's interesting, a couple years later, Nixon wrote in a book that he told Eisenhower, we got to watch out for him, he's a communist. But really at the time, he wrote a memo in which he said, I suspect that he's not really a communist, but is maybe under the influence of communist advisors. I'm paraphrasing that not quite correctly, but that was really the point of it. And then he really went back and sort of changed, you know, in hindsight, changed his viewpoint. So, you know, and then Castro comes to New York. He's greeted by 20,000 people at Penn Station, all these adoring fans. A guy in the CIA meets him at a hotel, in his hotel room, and interviews him. They smoke cigars together. It may have been the cigar smoke, but this guy comes away enamored of Castro, saying not only is he not a communist, he's an anti-communist. So Castro fooled a few people. And then he went back. The really interesting thing to me is he then goes back to Cuba and almost immediately starts behaving in a way, having won all this goodwill in the United States, behaving in a way that is definitely going to lose Eisenhower and anybody who had any sympathy for him. He starts appropriating American property. He starts giving speeches with all this anti-American rhetoric, behaving exactly like the proto-communist that some in the Eisenhower administration feared he was. So within less than a year of him coming to power, they were making plans to remove him.
The direct answer is he began to conduct himself in such a way.
Yes, and they got nervous very quickly. And Eisenhower just got, you know, Eisenhower being Eisenhower just got annoyed, you know, by this. Who does this guy think he is? Yeah. Eisenhower was already annoyed by Castro even before he came for that April 1959 visit. In fact, Eisenhower left and went to play golf in Augusta because he didn't want to be, you know, bothered with this fool in fatigues coming and trying to meet with him. He would have nothing to do with that. But they were not at that point ready to write him off as a communist. But that really, within months, they'd gotten to that point.
In New York for the General Assembly session was the greatest gathering of world leaders in modern times, all vying for the friendship and support of the new African states. One of the most fateful of many informal meetings in New York was that of Khrushchev and Castro, whose threat to Western Hemisphere solidarity was background for Ike's talks with Pan-American leaders. Castro swung closely in line with the communist bloc and seized almost all United States property in Cuba.
I've never read anybody who said this directly, but I get the sense that Eisenhower was a fellow who, being very accomplished and having worked hard and being quite smart, really tended to stand on dignity. You know, he had a high sense of his own dignity, and you know, you dasn't trample on that.
Yes. Eisenhower was a very good Cold War president, I have to say, and I didn't really think of him this way before I wrote this book. But, I mean, the image of Eisenhower is he was, you know, had one hand on the tiller of state and another hand on a 9-iron, and you know, he basically was off and wasn't involved in anything. But really, what he did is he downplayed things.
Yeah.
Which is so different than what Kennedy did when he came in, and everything became very heightened. The rhetoric became very heightened from the day of his inauguration.
President Kennedy's speech is brief and stirring.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
A significant portion is addressed to Latin America.
To our sister republics south of our border, we offer a special pledge to convert our good words into good deeds, in a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free governments in casting off the chains of poverty. But this peaceful revolution of hope cannot become the prey of hostile powers. Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
Eisenhower tried not to raise the stakes.
Yeah.
He didn't constantly, he let other people talk about the I mean, Richard Nixon was good at talking about, you know, the communist invasion. Eisenhower didn't get involved in that. He did have a kind of quiet dignity about him that some people mistook for not being very involved. Well, you know, in recent years, there have been a number of histories, biographies of Eisenhower that come out and shown very clearly how involved he was. And he certainly was involved in covert activity. I learned that. I mean, he had a very hands-on approach to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, as you said, he was responsible for Guatemala. He was responsible for what happened in Iran, which the Iranians have not forgotten about to this day. It's one of the problems between the two countries to this day. And a few other things. Whereas, you know, and it was all behind the scenes, whereas Kennedy makes an inaugural speech which says, let the word go forth to friend and foe alike that we will spare no anything to make sure that, whoa, you know, this was a little nuts.
He gives a lot of speeches like that.
Yeah. This came over extraordinarily well at the time.
Yeah.
But in the light of history, you say, oh my God, the guy was almost inviting disasters.
Well, I mean, you know, particularly when I mean, Kennedy ran on the so-called missile gap, this idea that the United States had fewer nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union, which was hogwash.
Yeah.
We knew very well from our U-2s that we had many more nuclear warheads and weapons and missiles than the Soviets. Now, Eisenhower couldn't advertise that fact because he'd be giving away spy technology and you know, intelligence. But the truth of the matter is, as Kennedy knew, we had 4 times as many missiles as the Soviet Union, and we had a 17-to-1 advantage in nuclear warheads. So
Kennedy knew this?
Kennedy knew this, yeah. We were way ahead of the Soviet Union. I mean, Kennedy may not have known this when he was running for president. He knew, he certainly knew there was no missile gap. That was bogus, but it was good politics. But once he became president, he of course knew that we were far superior. And so these statements that he would make, provocative statements, they scared Khrushchev. He gave, for example, this is after the Bay of Pigs, he gave an interview to Stuart Alsop, and in which he hinted at the possibility of a nuclear first strike. Now, Kennedy would never have done that, and it was really a tough statement for, to placate his people on the right, hawks in the United States, but a very dangerous thing to say, because Khrushchev did read that, and he thought, my God, the Kennedy's actually thinking of a nuclear first strike? Sometimes Kennedy was so rhetorically gifted, but he would sometimes let the rhetoric get so heated that it caused things to happen that shouldn't have happened.
This is a very common human phenomenon.
It is, sure.
I'm not justifying it. I'm simply saying that, people overspeak themselves. And the problem is the opponent, we are told all the time now, all the time for the last 30 years, don't listen to what the guy says, watch what he does.
Right.
Baloney.
Baloney, yeah.
Absolute baloney, because you never know whether he might end up doing what he says.
Yes. And of course, during the Cold War, it was all words. I mean, or putting in missiles and stuff. But I mean, it wasn't actually going to come to blows. It couldn't come to blows, or the world would end. So rhetoric mattered tremendously.
Yes, and it mattered in the elections.
It did.
And based on what you're telling me, maybe Nixon had a point. Nixon always thought that the election of 1960 was stolen from him in various different ways, including by Mayor Daley, but then the Republicans stole, it gets...
Right.
But gee, he also thought that, and you point this out in the book, Dulles had told Kennedy about the plans, and Nixon couldn't reply because even after he was told about the plans to do something with Cuba, Kennedy kept saying, we got to get rid of Castro, we got to get rid of Castro, knowing that Nixon couldn't come back and say, oh, well, we have a plan, we'll take care of that. Well, you read things like that, and on the one hand, Nixon is such a bad human being and president that you say, baloney. But then you hear what you have to say, hey, maybe not such baloney.
Yeah, it's a great story about what happened is before the fourth debate, the famous Kennedy-Nixon debates, Kennedy released a statement in which he said the Eisenhower administration should be supporting Cuban exiles to go back and overthrow Fidel Castro. Well, of course, that's exactly what the Eisenhower administration was doing covertly. Well, when Nixon read this, he went ballistic. He said, clearly, somebody told Kennedy that we were having this covert operation, and Nixon had been one of the main proponents of the operation. But he could not, so they go into the debate, this fourth debate, and Nixon, couldn't very well stand up and say, well, that's exactly what we're doing. But Nixon did something, strange. I mean, very Nixonian in a way. He made a very strong statement of why it would be an awful idea to support exiles to go into Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. And gave a very coherent and intelligent argument for why an invasion of supporting these exiles was a bad idea. But, exactly the opposite of what he actually believed. And he referred to that as his unpleasant and ironic duty. And that is a really interesting point in understanding Richard Nixon, because he also later wrote of that that's the first time he really thought that he'd been sandbagged, he thought, by Kennedy. And he has a great statement where he says something like, I vowed at that point never to be beaten by the Kennedys or anybody on the level of political tactics. And you sort of see the beginning of Watergate in those words, that he is, he thought that the Kennedys played dirty pool, and that's how you win. You got to play dirty pool. And he became committed to that line of thought.
This party, Republican Party, has stood still really for 25 years, its leadership has. It opposed all of the programs of President Roosevelt and others for minimum wage and for housing, economic growth, and development of our natural resources. And I believe that if we can get a party which believes in movement, which believes in going ahead, then we can reestablish our position in the world. Strong defense, strong in economic growth, justice for our people, guarantee of constitutional rights so that people will believe that we practice what we preach, and then around the world, particularly to try to reestablish the atmosphere which existed in Latin America at the time of Franklin Roosevelt. He was a good neighbor in Latin America because he was a good neighbor in the United States, because they saw us as a society that was compassionate, that cared about people, that was moving this country ahead. I believe it my responsibility as the leader of the Democratic Party in 1960 to try to warn the American people that in this crucial time we can no longer afford to stand still. We can no longer afford to be second best. I want people all over the world to look to the United States again, to feel that we're on the move, to feel that our high noon is in the future. I want Mr. Khrushchev to know that a new generation of Americans who fought in Europe and Italy and the Pacific for freedom in World War II have now taken over in the United States, and that they're going to put this country back to work again. I don't believe that there's anything this country cannot do. I don't believe there's any burden or any responsibility that any American would not assume to protect his country, protect our security, to advance the cause of freedom. And I believe it incumbent upon us now to do that. Franklin Roosevelt said in 1936 that that generation of Americans had a rendezvous with destiny. I believe in 1960 and 61 and 2 and 3, we have a rendezvous with destiny. And I believe it incumbent upon us to be the defenders of the United States and the defenders of freedom. And to do that, we must give this country leadership, and we must get America moving again.
Isn't there a rather significant body of opinion these days that holds they did play dirty pool?
Yeah, I think there is.
The plan, now Eisenhower later said, I guess, that under his administration there was no plan, there was a program. In other words, we decided we were going to get rid of Castro. That's the program. But we didn't have any plans about how you're going to do it. That's the way I interpret that.
Yeah, it's a semantic difference. I'm not really sure. It meant a lot to Eisenhower. It's never really meant a lot to anyone else.
Yeah, okay.
I think what he meant by a program is, I mean, Eisenhower had this for a year. And a lot of things were done under Eisenhower. You had training camps in Guatemala. You had an air force being assembled for the Cuban exiles to take out Castro. You had ships. I mean, a huge amount of logistical stuff happening. An invasion really being prepared. And you have Eisenhower supporting it. In fact, even suggesting shortly before he left the presidency to make it bigger. But he did later say, well, you know, it wasn't a plan. And I think what he meant is there was no green light. And there also no landing site had been chosen yet. I mean, a lot of what Eisenhower would have considered to be a plan, a full plan, was not yet in place. But the whole snowball was rolling and was very large by the time that Eisenhower left office. So and I think he tried to remove himself from any blame. And I think that he was being a bit unfair to Kennedy. Yeah, yeah. This didn't just start the day Kennedy came into office. It was this, I said a snowball, really more like a freight train. And Kennedy basically didn't know what to do to stop it.
It would be like saying we had no plan to invade Normandy in March of 1944.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Been a delightful opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you.
And to the audience, thank you for being with us. And I hope that you will stay tuned, as it were, for the next installment of Books of Our Time, when we will bring you part 2 of this interview on the Bay of Pigs and all sorts of associated problems with Jim Rasenberger.
I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.